now available in paperback and e-readers. Spellbound, a darker shade of black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller. I was watching an Amy Necrotique video and she proposed the question, where have all the young Goths gone? And she proposed that question because many younger Goths are no longer going to the clubs to experience the music of the subculture or to interact with other Goths in the subculture. And the reason why many younger Goths are no longer going to the clubs to experience the subculture or to learn more about the music of the subculture is due to the way American culture has pretty much changed. And the way American culture has changed is due to the way many children are raised these days. Now, back in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the early 1990s, during the early days and the peak of the goth subculture, many children were raised completely different. And the way we were socialized pretty much led to a lot of people having to go out in order to experience things. Now, in our early childhood development, we were socialized to pretty much interact with each other, and even the shyest person pretty much had to learn how to go out and do for themselves because that was how you pretty much learned how to survive. Now, many goths by nature are pretty much introverts, and they pretty much try to avoid social interaction whenever they can. However, back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, you had no choice other than to pretty much socially interact because it was all part of your childhood development and it was all part of your educational development because whenever you went to school, you had things that forced you to socially interact, such as gym class, recess, and in order to go out and get things like comic books or records, you had to go out to a comic book shop or a record store in order to do that. And that required you to have social interactions with others. And even if you were an introvert, if you wanted to go get that comic book or that record, you had to go out and go to a store. And all of these social interactions that you pretty much participated in taught you how to be social, taught you how to interact, and taught you how to pretty much survive in the world. So it was all about your survival process and all about your life process. These were part of the life skills that you learned growing up to become an adult. As a child, this was part of your natural process. You just had to go out to do things. You had to go out to play. You had to go out to go get your food. Everything you did pretty much was about you going outside and interacting with the world. So when you went out to go outside, going to a club was considered a part of that process. In fact, going to a club was considered a rite of passage for people who grew up in the 70s, people who grew up in the 80s, and grew up in the early 90s because going to the club was considered saying that you were an adult and you could pretty much drink. And that was part of your growth process growing up. So even if you were an introvert, this was all part of you growing up to become an adult. So that was part of your process and in learning how to survive and socially interact with the world. That's all part of that process. These kids today, their process for growing up is completely different from our process. Now, many kids in the goth subculture are introverts, and they have a hard time interacting with others and communicating with others, and they really feel uncomfortable in group situations. And the way we raise children these days exacerbates that problem because in today's public schools, many children, they don't have gym class, they don't have recess, and because they don't have gym class and recess, they don't get the life skills, they don't get the social skills, and they don't develop the basic skills that will help them go out and learn how to interact with others. So they have a hard time interacting with other people or communicating with other people. And this is one of the core reasons why this elitism thing has pretty much blown up out of proportion, because when you've got a lot of introverts and they have not developed social skills, they pretty much become very defensive, and because they're inside of themselves, they don't know how to interact with others or to read body language or to read expressions to understand that someone may be just trying to talk to you and try to help you out, but then you'll see that person as elitist. And this also has to do with the way we pretty much raise children. Now, a lot of parents over the last 30 years, they pretty much isolated their children, and they didn't let their kids go out to experience the world. Moreover, they didn't have to let them go out and experience the world because the world was pretty much brought to them through television and computers. So the kids who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they experienced a completely different world than the world of people who grew up in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, where we had no internet. And because they had internet, they pretty much experienced the world on a screen. Moreover, they didn't really go out much because mommy didn't want them to go out. She pretty much sheltered these kids because she felt she was going to make them safe and she was going to protect them. Then, when these kids went to school, they pretty much were sheltered even more because what happened is a lot of people who were my age back in the day, a lot of us were bullied, humiliated, and attacked all the time. And because that happened, a lot of kids were told that they could not have gym class, recess, school parties, all these rites of passage that pretty much led to a child developing social skills that would help them learn how to interact with the world. So those kids never got those life skills that would help them learn how to interact with the world. Moreover, a lot of the places that we used to go as a kid, such as the comic book store, the record store, and those places, a lot of those places pretty much closed during the 90s and the early 2000s due to the alleged gentrification of many neighborhoods. So a lot of the record shops we used to go to, they no longer exist because people get their music these days on Amazon.com. So they go get an MP3 player and they pretty much get their music that way. And a lot of people who used to get their goth music, they used to go to stores like here in New York in the Village, to the record stores like Tower Records or Record Explosion or Colony Records. They used to go to those type of stores to get their music, but because all the music now is on MP3, kids no longer need to go to a store to get records. So that trip pretty much was taken away. And the comic book industry, another place where a lot of kids were used to go, that industry declined. So a lot of kids don't really know about that industry. So the rites of passage that kids used to go out and go get their own stuff, they don't really do that anymore. The same thing with going to the movies. That's also another thing that kids don't do anymore that much because they have Netflix and they can pretty much wait for a movie to come out and stream it. And this is one of the core reasons why a lot of kids are introverts. They're pretty much into themselves and the world is pretty much catering to them, so they don't have to go out and experience it. So they really don't have the social skills to go out and interact with the world. So going to a place like a club, that's really something that makes them extremely uncomfortable because when you're kind of dealing with an introvert, they really try to avoid social situations. And the reason why they try to avoid social situations is because it's something that makes them uncomfortable, makes them uneasy, and it makes them not feel secure in themselves. And because they have been taught, raised this way from birth, they have been taught, the world caters to them, so they don't have to go to a place like a club. Whereas a kid from 25, 30 years ago, they had to go to the club because this was the only place they could go to be with people who were like themselves. So they pretty much had to go to this club if they wanted to experience those things and be a part of the subculture. So they had to go to the club. It was the only place where they would play the goth music, and it was the only place where other goths could come together. Whereas these days, most goths now congregate online because it's pretty much easier and it's more convenient. And when you're an introvert, you are going to try to avoid trying to have social interaction, especially if you're an introvert who was pretty much raised in it to be in an insular environment like the one established by many of today's mothers, because many of today's mothers want their kids to be safe. They want them to be an individual, and they want them to be, in many cases, this special little snowflake who never learns how to experience life. And this is one of the big problems with kids these days, is that they never learned how to experience this thing we call life, and that's why they don't want to go to the club, because They are pretty much afraid of rejection, they're afraid of being criticized, and they're afraid of being ridiculed, so they're afraid to go out and experience these things. And that's one of the reasons why they don't go out to the club. The other reason has to do with, again, the way that they are raised. Now, you will see Goths out and about, but you will not see them in the club because a lot of Goths pretty much they have a different approach to their social interactions because as introverts they do go out but they go places that are completely different than your club because your club is a very noisy environment and it's a very uncomfortable environment for them. So they go to different places to have their social interactions. And these environments are a little bit more comfortable for them and a little bit more relaxing for them. So you might, whenever you go out to see a goth these days, you might see them at a library, you might see them at a thrift store, or you might see them at a Barnes and Noble. And those environments are a lot more comfortable to them, it's a lot more relaxing for them, and it's a lot more easier for them to pretty much interact in. And when it comes down to big gatherings, the other place you might see goths at is Comic Con. And what a lot of people don't know is that the goth subculture, the science fiction and fantasy culture, the manga and anime culture, and the otaku culture, they all interact with each other and they pretty much are intertwined with each other. So you are definitely going to see goths at a place like Comic Con. And some businesses understand this, like Black Phoenix Alchemy Labs or BPAL Cosmetics, and they will set up booths at Comic Con because they know that there are large gatherings of goths who come to Comic Con. I saw a BPAL booth at New York Comic Con last year, and that showed me, how aware the BPAL company is of the goth subculture and its connections to the comic book world. So whenever you go to a Comic Con, you may see a lot of goths, and whenever you go to a comic book store, you may see a lot of goths. You might also see them at stores that sell manga and anime. You might see them there because that's another place they like to go. And there are other places they like to go again, like Starbucks and Barnes & Noble, because the environment is a bit more relaxing for the introvert, and it's a place where they feel comfortable going to. And that's one of the reasons why they like going to those kind of places. And whenever you go to a place like Comic Con, yes, it's maybe crowded and it might be slightly noisy, but when it comes down to it, you feel like you're among friends and you feel safe among friends, and you have this interest in common, such as comic books, science fiction, fantasy, manga, or anime, or otaku. You have these hobbies, and that makes introverts feel really comfortable because they feel like they're among people like themselves. So they have no problem going to those environments, but for them, going to a club would make them feel socially awkward, and that's one of the reasons why they try to avoid the club. They feel safer in environments like Starbucks or bookstores or thrift stores because those environments are a little quieter, those environments are a little bit more comfortable, and those environments, have things that they want to buy. And the other reason why you don't see a lot of goths, younger goths, going to clubs is because of the economy. Now, back in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, we had a completely different job market than the one we have today. The job market we had back then pretty much led to younger people having access to more money. So a kid could go to a place like a McDonald's or a Gap or a Macy's or any of these other stores out here and land themselves a stock job or a sales job or a counter job. And that job pretty much allowed them to have the money to go out here and not only have money to buy clothes from places like thrift stores, but to also have the money to go out and spend to go to the club. And a lot of kids these days, they really don't have that type of money to go out to a club because oftentimes they just can't get that type of job because people our age, in some cases, wind up working behind the counter at the Barnes and Noble, or working behind the counter at the McDonald's, or working behind the counter at the Macy's, or stocking at the Macy's. You have people 30 plus working these jobs When 30 years ago you had people who were 16, 17, 18, maybe 21 tops working these type of jobs, and because they had that money, they had money to go to the club on Friday night or Saturday night. These days, a lot of kids don't have that type of money, and they have to pretty much get their money a completely different way. And in many cases, they get their money from mom, or they get it from grandma, or they get it from auntie. And because their money pretty much is coming that way, they really don't have access to money on a steady or consistent basis that is their own. Whenever you get money from a parent, there's often times strings attached to it, whereas when you're working, you have your own money. And when you have your own money, what can you do? You can just pretty much you can spend that money the way you want. Now, these kids they get money, but it's like all the way it's spent is completely different because it's got strings attached to it in some cases. And they can spend money maybe on a video game, or they can spend money on comics, or they can spend money on manga and anime. But if they say they're going to take that same money and go to a club, they're not going to be able to get that money. So they have to spend it that way because that's the only way they get the money. And those who are working, again, if they do have money these days, because today's money really doesn't go that far. Um, Even if you make $10, $12 an hour, it really doesn't go that far. That after you've paid your bills, or you've pretty much paid for whatever you want to pay for, doesn't lend to enough money left over after a cover charge. So for a club, so they don't have the money to go out to the clubs anymore when it comes down to a lot of the younger Goths, because one, jobs are just very hard to come by, and two, money is very hard to come by. Many younger kids out here, they pretty much learn how to live without money or little money, so they pretty much don't even think about going to the club as something to do these days. They think about doing other things that are either cheaper or are going to lead to them being able to do and see other things, such as things like going out to a Starbucks where the drinks are cheaper, and plus the environment is a lot more amicable to them. Or they think about going to a Barnes and Noble where, again, the books are there and they're a little bit more cheaper. So for them, they're not spending as much money as they would going to a club, because in many clubs, there's a cover charge, there's a drink minimum that you have to pay, and this is all money that many younger kids just don't have anymore. Especially any kid who's under the age of 18, they really don't have that type of money. And if they do get money, again, it comes from their parents, and their parents are not going to really let them go to an environment like a club, especially if they have been sheltered for a long time. They're like, you say going to a club, they're going to start getting scared. Now, if you say going to a concert, they'll give them the money. Or if you say going to a place like, again, a Barnes & Noble or a Starbucks for a latte or something like that, they have no problem giving them money for that. But they have a problem giving them money for a club. And this is one of the things that's a big issue, because the way our economy is, it's very hard, especially for young people, to go out here and get those type of jobs and have their own money, because a lot of the jobs we had 30, 40 years ago, they no longer exist. They've been either sent overseas, or they have been pretty much eliminated due to technology. And technology is another thing that pretty much has led to kids not going to the club, because why should a person go to a club to go interact with people when an introvert is pretty much trying to avoid people, and technology makes it convenient for them to avoid people? Because with the goth subculture being all about the music, guess what? The kids can pretty much get the music these days on Amazon.com. So they figure like this: I can just go take my iPhone, download all the songs that I want, and they really don't think about experiencing the subculture inside of a club. So for them, they don't think of experiencing the club as important, because they figure, I've got all the music on my phone, I've got all the music on my computer, I don't need to go to this club because I've got everything the way I want. And when you're an introvert, you always want everything towards you. And this is the way our American culture pretty much is these days. It's very insular, it's very inside, and it pretty much is all about keeping people to themselves. So a lot of these kids, they're growing up completely different than we did. We did everything we had to do. We had to go outside in order to experience the world. They don't have to go outside to experience the world. And when they do go outside, it is to things that pretty much are convenient for them. Whereas when we went out into the world, we had to go outside because that was part of our survival process, that was part of our socialization, and that was part of how we learned how to adjust to the world. Now, if the clubs want to attract younger customers, they're going to have to adapt their approaches to reach the younger customer, because the younger customer isn't doesn't have any incentive to go to a club anymore. They have everything pretty much presented to them on their phones via YouTube or stores like Amazon.com, or they can just go shop online and pretty much buy any sort of clothing that they want and pretty much experience the subculture from an online approach. They don't have to go outside to experience it. So these businesses have to go and find ways to reach the customer. And some of the approaches they may have to do may have to be doing things like trying to reach the younger customer by having nights that appeal to youngsters who are 18 and under or 16 and under. They may have to have events where they pretty much have a streaming connected to it, or they may have to do things that market to the younger customer to reach them in ways that and forums that they're used to. And this is something that may be a challenge for many bar owners and club owners to do, because the younger customer is out there. They are experiencing the subculture, but they're not going the usual places that people did back in the 90s and in the 80s to experience them from, because many of those places have pretty much closed, or they pretty much don't know about them because they didn't grow up to experience them. Moreover, the way they were raised pretty much never taught them how to experience those places, and the way they were socialized never taught them how to experience those places. So the world that they're living in is completely different than the world we lived in maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. Because I remember, back in the early 2000s, there wasn't everything online. You still had to go out. You still had to go to different places. These days, almost everything is online, and you could pretty much get anything by just typing in .com whatever, and it's shipped to your house, or you have tickets to this event, and it's just pretty much in your hands like that. So everything is online, and that's why we see a lot of the subculture going online, because this is where everything is going for people. And when you have introverts and a way to avoid people, they're going to take advantage of that opportunity to avoid people, and they're going to use that to avoid people. So when it comes down to a lot of Goths, they are introverts, they are inside themselves, and a lot of them, they will do everything they can to avoid a social interaction. So a place like a club really makes them uncomfortable, but what's really strange is they will go to some things like concerts and Comic-Cons because they see people in common, and you have to find a way to appeal to the things that people have in common to help them go to the clubs and experience them, because there is nothing like experiencing something live or experiencing people to help you overcome the social anxiety and shyness many kids have. Now, a lot of kids, they struggle with it more these days because they are so isolated and everything is so insular. But there is a way for kids to overcome that. Now, kids of our generation, we had to overcome it because that was the only way we could survive in the world. And kids today need to understand that the world isn't a horrible place. People aren't really that bad. And not everyone who is talking to you and disagrees with you is an elitist. And that's all part of the growing up process that a lot of kids are missing out on because of the way they are raised and socialized. And because they are raised and socialized, in a dysfunctional way, they pretty much think that they can avoid the club. But the club is a major part of the subculture, and it's a part of the subculture kids should experience. And there has to be a way for club owners to try to reach out to the kids so that they can see what's great about it. And I believe what they have to do is they're going to have to adapt their marketing approaches to reach the younger customer and try to find ways to reach them on the platforms on social media that they go to. Moreover, there has to be, things that relate to their limited income, because when it comes down to the kids today, they really don't have the money like kids used to, and they don't spend it the way we used to. So for them, they need an incentive to come to the club, because after they've spent their money on their comics, their lattes, their action figures, and their video games, you have to find a way to show them why it's important to spend money at the clubs and why they should care about spending money at the clubs. And part of that is hooking them in with things like no cover charge nights for Goth Night, or lower price drinks for Goth Night. And that's a way to get the customers to come in to the clubs and get those new customers to come into the clubs, because the younger customer is the future of the subculture and from a business perspective. And if you can get the customers coming into places younger, then you can pretty much get them coming to venues on the regular. And once they start coming to venues on the regular, then you have a new group of customers who will pretty much frequent the clubs and see what's great about them, and then share it with their friends. If you want to check out my Goth YA novel Spellbound, you can click the link in the description box. And if you want to donate to this channel and help me continue to produce videos and blogs and publish books, you can click the link to my Patreon in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.